The people who used to vote for the left were people at the bottom of society, often, as people who thought that maybe the communists, maybe the socialists were going to do something for the workers, were going to help them out. That is, after all, it was a workers' revolution. But what happened over the last 50 or 60 years, particularly sort of accelerating after the 90s maybe, is that the people who vote for the left are increasingly members of the elite classes. They're members of the upper classes, the wealthy, the upper middle class, the university educated.
And hello, welcome back, friends. How are you doing? Happy New Year. We're good to be back here. First episode of 2023. You know the drill, I think. If you're a regular viewer, my name's Christopher Snowdon. You're watching The Swift Half with Snowdon. It's called The Swift Half because it's half hour long. That's really all there is to it. And we have a different interesting guest every week to talk about something that I hope you will be interested in. I certainly will be. And this week it is Marc Sidwell, who is the author of this book, which I picked up from the IA office. He's actually in the IA now, and I'm at home, which seems wrong. But I picked up his book, The Long March, a couple of weeks ago. It'd been lying around the office for a while. I think it came out, did it, Mark, during lockdown or just before lockdown?
Yeah, it was perfectly timed for a release in spring of 2020. So ideal to bring out a book.
You didn't have a launch party then? No. Suffered from that problem, but it's a very invigorating read. Nice and short as well, which I always like. 110 pages basically, and the subtitle is "How the Left Won the Culture War and What to Do About It." And you do have a few suggestions about what to do about it. Can we kick off? But I'll just read a little bit from the start of chapter 10. You say, "The culture war for Britain's institutions has been lost. Not to the communists and socialists who once dreamed of a Gramscian march to hegemony, but to the political class, left liberal heirs of Blair, but long past mere party allegiance. This self-serving, interconnected blob dominates our centralized elite. Their status insulates them from the consequences of their failures, while the harm falls unheard on those living on the periphery. As managerialists, they prefer counterintuitive proposals to common sense, targets over real effects, and power above everything else." Expand on that, will you, Mark?
It's a nice cheery prescription, isn't it? But there's a very interesting paper by Thomas Piketty, who people may know better from his book Capital. But he did a very interesting paper called "The Rise of the Brahmin Left." And what he points out in that is that across France, Britain, the United States, really the developed Western world, you can see that the people who used to vote for the left were people at the bottom of society, often, as people who thought that maybe the communists, maybe the socialists were going to do something for the workers, were going to help them out. That is, after all, it was a workers' revolution. But what happened over the last 50 or 60 years, particularly sort of accelerating after the 90s maybe, is that the people who vote for the left are increasingly members of the elite classes. They're members of the upper classes, the wealthy, the upper middle class, the university educated. And that's a huge shift, which is not always necessarily very well explained. I think we're all searching around to see exactly how that came to be, and part of the thing that I talk about in the book is trying to understand the history of that. But the result of that has been a shift that's almost happened unnoticed, where the people who are at the top of society are left-wing, and that means that the things that they're trying to impose are often less about sort of stability and keeping the system going in a rather conservative way, or even in the free market way out of the sort of the 80s idea, but it's much more about social control and about controlling economies from the center, and about bureaucracy, and that's actually been quite bad, I think, for people at the periphery of society who they might want to help, but they often have quite bad ideas about how to do that.
Now, I suppose one of the questions is, how much of a conscious movement is this? Because when you talk about long march through the institutions and invoke Gramsci, of course, it sounds like a deliberate conspiracy. Let's face it. I mean, it sounds like a bit like a conspiracy theory. Whereas other people, including myself, I think, really would say, well, there's just a lot of rather stupid people around who believe in some daft things that happen to be quite trendy, and they tend to get ahead of people who are seen as being, stuck in the past or whatever.
Well, I think in many ways that's true. I try and make this a sort of non-conspiratorial take. it's absolutely true if you look back that people in the late 60s, in the 70s, quite influential people in American and intellectual life, and therefore in the sort of wider intellectual life of the West and Europe, did very much have this idea that the way to take over society for sort of revolutionary purposes was to do a sort of long march through the institutions, was to try and do that. And there were people like Marcuse in particular, Herbert Marcuse in America. The idea actually comes from a guy in Germany, but Marcuse was probably one of the most influential people promoting it in the US. They were actively trying to do that. And you get examples here maybe in the mid-70s when there are people trying to take over the North London Polytechnic and so forth.
And the Fabians, of course, that was explicitly there.
Yeah, the Fabians are earlier, but they sort of show that the power of this sort of thing. But I think it's not so much that came to pass, but it's a very interesting thing to revisit now and look back, because what those people were searching for in a way has happened, not, as I say, for exactly their purposes. Not that there's a bunch of card-carrying Marxists in every institution, but there has been a sort of shift at the top of institutions, and as a result what those institutions are trying to do has changed. And I think that creates a problem for society often, because what's going on as a result now is there's lots of people trying to do things, sort of socially activist causes, which aren't really to do with the function of the institutions that they're part of.
And when it comes to your old-fashioned socialists who just want to have control the means of production and so on, you can see how that's a belief that would drive people forward. Whereas the people you're talking about seem, well, it's rather less ambitious, isn't it? For one thing, is it just kind of power for power's sake? I mean, what is the great pull for example, diversity and inclusion? I mean, it might be a nice thing in some respects. It depends on how you take it, but is that really a powerful enough drive for people to kind of more or less devote their lives to it and corrupt institutions towards? Well,
I mean, power, you talk about power. One source of power, of course, is it gives you power over people. It helps you, get a job and hold on to power within institutions. So I think that's definitely going on. And that's quite a powerful motivator. People use it in ways to advance their own careers. And actually a lot of the sort of jockeying you see people using this stuff is to sort of get people out who stand in the way of their careers or to consolidate their positions. I think there's definitely some of that going on. But something I talk about in the book too, and I think this is very powerful, is the effect of having a public opinion that's not necessarily a private opinion. This is an idea that the economist Timur Kuran talks about a lot, preference falsification. So you can end up in a situation where it's not so much that people believe in this, but they start to think this is what everyone else believes, this is what I have to believe in public. And so you can end up with a sort of whole class sort of uniting around certain things that, without necessarily all privately believing it, but it's become what's the acceptable thing to believe and to share in public. And then that can become, quite a strong thing that's hard to break out of.
And then you talk about the preference cascade, which I'm not even sure I'd heard about that phrase before, which is probably
it's a book that called Public Truths, Private Lies, or Private Truth. I forget which way around it goes. Anyways, Timur Kuran's book came out about 25 years ago, but it really is very much a book, I think, for our times, because he talks about the end of communism in Eastern Europe, and it happened extraordinarily quickly. People really, even the people who were the activists, the dissidents, didn't think it was about to fall. That everyone was convinced it was quite stable, really. And then suddenly, overnight, it collapses, and people were literally stoking boilers because they were, on the outskirts of society. They were sort of, being put there by the communist authorities. They were stoking boilers in the morning, and in the afternoon they were at a cabinet meeting, and then having to run back to stoke the boilers because no one else had taken it over yet. And Timur Kuran explains how that can happen, because when it's an opinion that everyone sort of has to have in public, and then you get a crack in that, when people suddenly see, oh, actually, maybe other people don't think communism's a great idea. But it's like a stable state. It has to go from one to the other very fast. It's like everyone knows that communism is the only way to do things, to communism's a load of crap and it really doesn't work. So overnight it switches from one to the other, and then suddenly everyone has to conform to the new public opinion. And that's why it changes so fast, and there's a sort of mathematical model of how that happens.
And I get the sense from the closing chapters of the book, bear in mind when this was written, which was just after the Tory majority in late 2019, obviously before COVID, and after Brexit. I get the impression you saw both Brexit and the Boris Johnson landslide as being a sort of preference cascade.
Yeah, I mean, one of the very powerful things about elections, of course, is that, and votes in general, is that they are private. And so you can express a private opinion there that you may not say in public. And you know, otherwise it can be very hard to get people to break through that sort of sense of what they can't say in public. There's some studies that have been done on polling where you would have to have the person who's taking the poll down, even if they say, look, no one's going to know about this, and it's just private, you can say whatever you think. But people wouldn't express what they really thought unless they saw them using a pen that was like for the particular partisan political point of view that they were worried about saying in public. So unless they thought, oh, this is someone who's really on my side, sort of secret handshake, that they would actually express their opinion. But you can in a polling booth. And so elections are still a way that you can break through that wall of what's acceptable to say in public.
But the opinion polls have changed a lot since this book was published, of course. It's really another very, very quick bit. This is actually only 2 pages after the last bit I quoted, but you say, Mr. Johnson's position is secure, but the tail risks are too large for him to be comfortable. Possessed of a narrow window of opportunity to seize the post-Brexit initiative, he should take political action to effect cultural change. Now, of course, that never happened.
No.
And are you at all optimistic that it will happen under anybody else?
I think it's quite unlikely. I mean, Labour look like they're going to win, and it's quite hard to see how that doesn't happen. They are still quite vulnerable on these cultural questions, but Keir Starmer is, I think, at least aware of that and trying to, not seem as vulnerable on them as he might be. But it's not clear that the Tories want to fight on this sort of territory anyway. They find it a bit low class, perhaps, and a bit embarrassing. So they don't really get involved with it, even though it's a sort of vulnerability for Labour. And I think the Tories have obviously had such a disastrous time in office that their polling is so bad, it's hard to see how they could pull it back anyway. No, I mean, the book came out when Boris seemed like he had a lot of power and influence, and maybe he would do some things. And of course, then COVID came along, and Boris was Boris, and none of that really happened. So yeah, some of my optimism about the possibilities have not really worked out, sad to say.
You quote Dominic Cummings quite a few times in the book. Is he the kind of guy that you had a bit of faith in to shake things up?
I mean, he certainly had an interest in doing things differently, looking at a quite bold civil service reform. But I think all the appetite for bold reform doesn't seem well, either it's not there at all, or everyone started to think, oh, well, we can't really change anything at all. And I think that's the most worrying thing at the moment in all sorts of ways, just a sense of, I don't know, of stasis. And I talk about the blob, which is this idea comes out of education policy more specifically. It's sort of been applied more widely, this idea that everything is sort of connected to everything else. And if you try and reform things, someone from another agency will defend it, or the status quo has just become in everyone's interest. So it becomes very, very, very hard to change anything at all. And obviously if the status quo is, static and not growing very fast and, not very free in lots of ways, that's a real problem.
I mean, I take the point that, there can be a civil service which is self-serving in whatever way, or has its own political goals and views and purposes and public choice theory and all this kind of stuff. And I get that it's hard and that the civil service can slow you down, but the Tories have been in power for 13 years now, and I don't believe it's that hard to get a few things done. I guess Gove did actually get something done, maybe with Cummings' help in education. There's one or two areas just about you can think, well, they kind of push back. But it seems to me it's not really a culture war if only one side is fighting it. And it doesn't seem to me that the Conservatives have been fighting it very much. Is that because they don't really have the will, or do you really think the blob is so powerful they just can't do anything?
No, I mean, the blob, especially taken a sort of shorthand for the civil service, is can't be blamed for everything. I mean, part of what I say in the book, really, when I say that the culture war, in a sense, is lost, is like the Conservative Party is part of that blob, if you like, is part of that sort of way of thinking. It's really been taken over by all of these issues, and that it's not so much a force against it, or I mean, it's done things like, I don't know, bring in compulsory relationship education, which has obviously been, since I wrote the book, has been taken over by activists in quite dramatic ways. And you might think, oh, that would sort of thing that would get done by Labour, and then the Conservatives be complaining about it. But no, they sort of thought, oh, but why don't we do this? They're within the system in a sense, rather than being the force against it, it seems to me.
Well, yeah, I'm just quite a recent example. It's only a small example, but you may have seen the thing last week about with the Food Standards Agency, right? And Susan Jebb, who runs the Food Standards Agency, she said that bringing in cake to the office is like passive smoking. Now, okay, regardless of exactly how the Food Standards Agency said, look, this is not our position. But I know who Susan Jebb is because I've been aware of her. She's just a big nanny statist, right? And she's just always pushing for advertising bans, taxes, all the usual kind of stuff. Now, that firstly is not within the Food Standards Agency's remit at all. It's never what they were supposed to do. It's like Food Standards Agency is one of the classic examples, I think, of mission creep. But she was only appointed, I think, last year to 2021 to this job. And I'm not saying she's some, communist or something, but she at the very least, she's going to make the Conservative Party's life difficult, right? So just from purely from the perspective of self-interest, political self-interest, I don't understand why they keep appointing these people rather than somebody who is a bit sounder or even just neutral or just going to get on with the day job.
Yeah, it's a real problem, but I think the problem is deeper than just, oh, we should appoint better people. I mean, people have been trying that for a long time. And I know Conservative Home, for example, has had a sort of campaign for a few years of trying to advertise these jobs and make sure that people who are a bit more conservative, maybe a bit more liberal in their outlook, go for them. But it doesn't seem to work. And this partly goes back to this idea that it's just, this has become the view of the educated classes. So, there's just, it's pretty dominant. So most people are going to think this way. And just in general, like, if it's a big regulatory agency, by its nature, it's going to attract people who are interested in regulating things and controlling people's lives. I mean, the way to reform it is probably to change that system. Once you're in a sort of system with lots of quangos and heads in them, well, who are the people who are going to want to do that? And even if people come in with quite sort of liberal ideas, they'll either find themselves sort of ostracized and sort of pushed out by the system, or they'll find themselves somewhat co-opted by it. It's kind of my view.
Yeah, and you, I think, quote Hayek towards the end of the book, saying that conservatives fight with the socialists over who's going to be in charge of various things, when really the question is whether these things should even exist in the first place.
Yeah, and I think there's a very strong strain on the right. It seems to me a lot of the sort of young intellectual right in Britain and America, which is is very post-liberal. They're very interested in seizing the tools of the state, but for things that they think are more conservative. And that worries me. I don't think it's a great answer, but I can sort of see why they look around and they see this, all these agencies of control, and they think, well, why don't we have a bit of that? But I mean, my view is once you create these things, once you start to use this central power and you try and do things that you think are better with it, or maybe a bit more conservative or a bit more libertarian or liberal or whatever, the trouble is you've just created this thing that's going to be then very hard to get rid of, and which your enemies or other people who have a very different view will just take over next time. And I think that's increasingly, that will just always been the history of what happens to these things over time. So the answer is not to, oh, let's create another agency and we'll make sure it's on our side this time, because it won't be after the next election. I mean, the national curriculum, I think, is quite a good example. Margaret Thatcher thought, oh, this will be a great thing. We'll use this just to sort of, keep schools in line, and it'll be a simple thing, and we'll just make sure that people are learning, the right sorts of things. And it becomes this huge exercise in bureaucracy, and there's a massive fight over it. And then it becomes, a tool that can be used to really shape how children think about all sorts of, popular issues.
Yeah, what do you think is going to happen with the Conservative Party after the next election if they get battered? Some people saying that it might just have to split because it's a broad church, but is it so broad that it can really fit all the people in, you know, who are there at the moment, and the members, right?
Yeah, and I mean, you wonder what's left. It'd be interesting to see who's left. I suppose if they have a massive clear out of MPs, then you know what sort of factions do the MPs who are left fall into? That might have some bearing on it. But I don't see, you know, other parties snapping around that look to me like they're plausible replacement candidates, and it's very, very hard to start a new party. Of course, Margaret Thatcher in many ways took over the Conservative Party for a slightly different view of the world in many ways. You know, there was always other wings within the Conservative Party that didn't really like her vision. So maybe someone comes along with a different idea and drives it forward again. They do have young talent, particularly, of course, Kemi Badenoch, I think, but whether she can actually do much if they can't actually win any seats, hard to say.
Yeah, I mean, I was making the point I made about the Food Standards Agency, not to go on about that too much, but it's not that important, but just it happens to be the right example. I made this point on Twitter about why, you know, these people are going to be Conservatives, why do they keep appointing these people? And somebody responded by saying, well, firstly, that I'm not a Conservative, so it's not my place to talk, which is fair enough. But also, actually, people like me have no idea what Conservatives like or want. And actually, the general public really wants a lot more things banned than are currently being banned. And then therefore I should pipe down and set up a libertarian party or something like that, which, yeah, up to a point is true, except that there are actually quite a few people like me who are in the Conservative Party, and they're not very impressed with the way things are going. And 2/3 of them voted for Liz Truss and so on. And I just don't know, you know, if they get a walloping at the polls next time. They've got to regroup, and so it seems to me there'll be a battle for the heart of the party, I think, going on, the soul of the party, whatever they say.
Yeah, and there's this fascinating division, which I think you're pointing to there, between the membership and the MPs themselves, which in a way goes to what I was saying earlier about this division between, you know, the sort of the elite factions at the top of society these days and their views and their sort of fashionable views that they share, and then, you know, the rest of society, or the sort of the rank and file, if you like, the rank and file of the Conservative membership isn't very impressed with a lot of this stuff, but they seem to be stuck bizarrely with a bunch of MPs who think things that they don't have much interest in, but they don't know where to get MPs who actually represent their views.
Indeed, yeah. And it's going to be, what, 14, 15 years in power, albeit, you know, 5 years with the Lib Dems. It's a long time to be in power. And yeah, after Thatcher and Major, at least they could turn around and say, well, the country is demonstrably better than it was in 1979. And very few people could seriously, you know, question that. And we left the economy in a good place. And they can't say anything like that this time. You know?
No, I suppose what you can say, but it's a bit less appealing, is just things could always be worse.
Could have been worse.
The important thing in life to remember, things could always be worse. Okay. We could have had Jeremy Corbyn, which I think would have been, you know, a sort of historic disaster, and we didn't have that, and that's something to be very grateful for. But I think it's still entirely possible for things to get even worse than they are now. So
that's the spirit. That's the kind of thing we like on this show, a bit of realistic pessimism. What have you been up to since you wrote this book? Which I should say you can download, folks, free of charge, I believe.
I'm not sure if you can anymore. For a long time you could.
Oh,
yeah,
right.
I tried the other day, and
I'll lend it to you. Send me
there's an ebook on Kindle if people want, and you can get the hard copy from the New Culture Forum. I've actually got a video series coming out with the New Culture Forum in March, which has been quite an epic project we've been working on. It's a sort of survey of the history of the West. So it's sort of grand project in the sort of civilizational history line. So a bit different to this, but yeah, looking forward to that. But it's a lot of work, so nearly there with that.
Good luck with that. I wanted to ask you about something else, actually, because you mentioned him a few times in your book, which is James Burnham, The Managerial Revolution. You've read this, I assume. I think you mentioned it. I'm kind of interested in this book, partly, in fact, mostly because Orwell used it as, it was a big inspiration on 1984. And actually, I think that, you know, Burnham was wrong about an awful lot of things.
Absolutely.
As Orwell pointed at the time, he completely called the Second World War wrong and the post-war era wrong. But his basic argument in this seems to me to have stood the test of time quite well, really. And it's no wonder you mention it in your book, because you're kind of writing about the same kind of thing, which is essentially about elites, elites who are not particularly driven by strong political ideology, but nevertheless get to rule the world. What's your take on this book?
Yeah, well, a part of the book that's resonated a lot is the part where I talk about managerialism, and I think that's perhaps because an awful lot of people find themselves living within organizations that have a lot of sort of managerial bloat around them, and organizations need management. Management is very important in the sort of society that we have, but management creates the danger of sort of weird theories and sort of bloated bureaucratic structures, and then those structures developing their own interests ahead of the actual organization and its core purpose, and that's a real problem. And I think people feel that. And one of the things that I think offers some hope in a way, if people can think of how to do it, and I suggest a few ideas in the book, but I'm sure that there's more there, is just, and perhaps this speaks to a more libertarian spirit as well, is how you can help free people up a little bit so they don't feel controlled from the top by bureaucracy, so they don't feel that they've got to fall in line with some complicated administrative system around them. I talk in the book a little bit about schools and whether schools might work better if they were sort of professional associations, more like for lawyers or something like that. But that's just a small example. I mean, one of the interesting things about the culture war in the US in university campuses is people often think, oh, it must be the professors are the problem. Well, it's certainly true that universities in the US, the professors are much more left-wing even than they used to be. But the most left-wing people on the campuses are the administrators. And they have been growing like crazy. They've almost doubled in number. So these vast administrative bodies that have immense power and aren't really tied to the academic goals of the institution are a real problem. And I think thinking about sort of managerial bloat, all these sort of layers of administration, and that problem is, and how to release people from that burden and get them to be more productive and more sort of excited by what they're doing there's an opportunity there if people think about it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's something I find myself talking about more and more these days, is autonomy being absolutely crucial and something that's missing from so many people's lives, and HR, which I think the government should aim for. No company with fewer than 250 employees should need to have an HR person, is my view, because the law should be simple enough for any sensible person to abide by it. The HR people are there because the laws keep piling up all the time. The bosses can't realistically know what the rules are. But more to the point, you can't just assume just because you're a normal, decent person that you're going to be abiding by the law, because there's always things to trip you up. So I don't think that, that should be the aim. Call them personnel departments for a starter, which is a much nicer word than human resources, which is a horrible word, makes people sound like cold or something. And give people more autonomy. And the two things are obviously linked. But I think the health service is a good example where people don't get enough autonomy, the endless amounts of bureaucracy there, but all sorts of areas when you speak to people, we're educating people more than ever and trusting them less and less to be able to just do the right thing. And I think that the answer there is just basically massive deregulation.
Yeah, exactly. It's a regulatory problem, as you say. And I think that's also a source of hope in a way, because once you see it that way, and I try and frame it that way a bit at times in the book, then you see something that has some sort of political fix. Vague cultural issues can be worrying to people. They don't know how to fix them, But if there's a regulatory problem, as we're just saying, that has some of these knock-on effects, well, that's something you can try and reform politically. There's a target there. And I do think that sense of autonomy is so powerful. If you want people to experience something in their lives that makes them think, oh yeah, that's my politics, I want more of that. That experience of autonomy, that hope of that, or even also just making them aware of the lack of it that they may have, that's a very powerful thing to connect with, I think. Maybe gets past some of these sort of tired tropes about left and right and Tories or not.
Well, it just makes people's jobs more enjoyable, basically.
Yeah.
So you're not going to get as much turnover. You're not going to have so much early retirement. One of the big issues we've seen in the last few years, all
Sure.
these people between 50 and 64 retiring early.
Yeah, it's
And
extraordinary, isn't it?
there's I don't know all the reasons for it, but I think one of them is people just go, actually, I've realized during COVID that I'm quite happy being at home a lot of the time.
Yeah.
I've realized, actually, I look at the figures, if you're not paying for this and that, getting to work and so on, I won't have as much money, but I'd rather have a bit less money than have to put up with some stupid boss and daft rules. I mean, I think that's my interpretation. It's an example I give a lot, but I'll give it again because I don't think I've told you before. But my auntie used to be a district nurse, and she went back into profession after having kids, and she didn't really need to do the work for money as such, but she did it because she found the job satisfying and so on. But the thing that made her finally decide she was going to quit was when they said that the nurses couldn't use the toaster for health and safety reasons. They took the toaster out of the staff room, and she just thought, well, it was a straw that broke the camel's back. It was just one thing after another, but that was the one that really stood out for her. And it's so senseless, it's so needless to be pushing intelligent, experienced people around in that way. And I wonder how many other people have just got sick of working for that reason.
No, I think that's very true, right? So all these sort of, something in de Tocqueville about that, isn't there? A sort of this sort of network of small rules that sort of constrain people, and that's the sort of one of the bigger dangers of democracies over time. And I think we do have a real problem with that now. And it's so the people who might revive the Conservative Party, or indeed whichever party, but just might have a new political idea, maybe are the people who can do that, who can sort of cut through the net of rules in a way that people can see just allows them to do things better and not be caught up in the world of silly, petty rules. And of course, that world of silly, petty rules is also, what powers a lot of the, all these diversity commissars and whatnot, because that's where their power lies.
Completely, yeah. Right, Mark, our half hour is up. Thank you very much for joining us. Folks at home, it's not free, but you can go to Amazon. It's well worth whatever it is. And I'll be back in a couple of weeks with another Swift Earth. Thanks for watching, and thank you if you're a donor. If you want to be a donor to the IA, go to ia.org.uk/donate or patreon.com/IEA London. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.